Okay, welcome to NTI Day number 23. Okay, today we're going to discuss the Korean War. Okay, so I mentioned it briefly when I was talking about Truman. This is going to pop up. This is the first kind of, actual violence that's going to take place after World War II ends. Okay, so we're going to talk about it and kind of describe how it happened and then what happened. I know you've watched the video on it already and hopefully answered those questions from the first set of NTI work that I sent home, but there's some stuff I want you to know about it. This one shouldn't be too terribly long. All right, so as we go through the PowerPoint, you can see on the map where Korea is. It's right in between China and Japan. It's a little peninsula that sticks off of the eastern edge of Asia. As World War II was dying down, the communists from the Soviet Union are going to take over about half of Korea. And so they get about half of it before Japan finally surrenders. And so they're going to draw a line right there on the map at the 38th parallel, which gives the Soviet Union the northern half above the 38th parallel, and the United States controls the area below it. Okay, so the 38th parallel you'll hear a lot, but that is basically where North and South Korea is divided. The Soviets, of course, are going to put a communist government in place. It's going to be led by Kim Il-sung, who is the grandfather of Kim Jong-un, who is the head of North Korea today. His father, so his grandfather, father, and now grandson have ruled over the last 75 years or so. The South is going to be a democracy, and we put Syngman Rhee in charge. He's elected. Okay, and so the leaders of South Korea are going to vary and change with elections over the years. But there's only going to be 3 different people who have ruled in the North since communist North Korea was created. Basically, we've kind of kept our distance from the Soviet Union, not wanting this Cold War to turn hot. But Stalin was always looking to test the U.S., and he believed that we weren't going to protect South Korea if it was invaded. So he's going to notify Kim Il-sung that if the North invaded the South, the Soviet Union would help by supplying weapons and things like that. They weren't going to go there and fight themselves, but he wanted to unify Korea under the communist flag. Okay, and so with a little push by Stalin, Kim Il-sung is going to move on that and invade South Korea. So on June 25th, 1950, communist forces invade, and they just overwhelm the South. South appeals to the United Nations for help, and it is voted on, and the United Nations is going to send forces to South Korea. Now, the Soviet Union wasn't there, so they didn't vote. They could have blocked this from happening, but they weren't there, and so they didn't vote, and that is why we end up going over there. Most of the forces that go are going to be American. We're going to make up most of those forces. 50% of the ground forces, 86% of the Navy, and 93% of the Air Force. And Douglas MacArthur, our old friend Douglas MacArthur, is chosen to lead the United Nations forces. So you remember him from World War I, World War II. He's a very famous, highly decorated military man. Okay, and he becomes the head of all the fighting forces in Korea. By the time we get there, you'll see on this little map an area called the Pusan Perimeter. The North Korean forces had completely surrounded the Democratic South Korean forces at Pusan. And it was just couple of miles worth of territory that all the South Korean forces had been pushed back into. And so basically this is what it looks like when MacArthur arrives. He comes up with a pretty daring plan. He was not one to just do things by the book. He wanted to look for an advantage. And so basically what he did, if you look on the next slide, he decides to invade it in Incheon. And you saw this on the video if you watched it. But he invades behind the North Korean forces, which all of a sudden it looks like they're going to be surrounded. And so they basically run for it after the invasion at Incheon and barely escape back into North Korea. So MacArthur has now actually done what the, basically followed his orders as to what to do from the United Nations. But he does not want to stop right there because he thinks, well, this will happen again. He doesn't like the communists. So he asks for permission to go into North Korea after them, which is granted to him. All right, and so when the UN forces invade North Korea, they just roll over the North Koreans. Basically, MacArthur promises his troops they'd be home by Christmas in 1950 because the North Korean army is just disintegrating in front of them. But the further he pushes north after North Korea, the closer he gets to China, which is also communist. And the Chinese are massing forces along the Yalu River because they think America and the UN forces will go into China, and they want to stop that from happening. So as soon as we get pretty close to the Yalu River, the Chinese troops come pouring across the river after the American forces and push them back into South Korea. So basically what the Chinese would do is they would just overwhelm you. They would send just wave after wave after wave of troops after their target, and the bodies would just pile up, but the UN guns would basically overheat and quit working because they're just firing nonstop because the Chinese are coming at them nonstop. And so eventually the Chinese could overrun and take the territory they wanted. MacArthur is going to inform his superiors that this is an entirely different war now, that the way it had been fought is not going to work anymore. Okay? And because of that, MacArthur wants to do something a little bit different. He urges Truman to nuke China, to drop atomic bombs on the Chinese, which seems a little bit it seems like a pretty dumb idea because the Soviet Union also has atomic bombs, and if we start dropping them on China, then the Soviet Union will also most likely, or could use those against us. So Truman says no. MacArthur basically calls him soft, and he doesn't want to defeat communism and criticizes his boss. So Truman fires MacArthur in the middle of the war and replaces him with General Matthew Ridgway. And from that point on, it became a stalemate. It did not move very much along the 38th parallel. So basically, they're back to where they were at the very beginning. And the Chinese can't push into South Korea, and the Americans can't push into North Korea. And so fighting is going to continue along that line for about 2 years, with nothing really being gained by either side. Okay, and so finally, at the end of July in 1953, an armistice was called, a ceasefire. And if you remember from the video, this war technically isn't even over. the two sides remain in basically they remain at war, but they haven't really fought since 1953. So 67 years ago in July, this war stopped, but is still technically going on. And both sides conduct basically like war games, like tests, just in case it starts back up. And that's why Kim Jong Un is like fired off what he calls these nuclear weapons and tested them during this time period because he basically considers these war games that America and South Korea put on as an act of war. And so he wants to remind everybody that he's there and is dangerous. Okay, but there have been some thaws and some breakthroughs recently. You probably remember a couple of years ago, the leaders of North Korea and South Korea met at the 38th parallel and like set foot in each other's sides. Like the Kim Jong Un stepped into South Korea and the head of South Korea stepped into North Korea. This was right before the Winter Olympics. Donald Trump said he was going to, put an end to the Korean War and work out a peace. That hasn't actually happened, although there has been more communication and things are a little bit better. Kim Jong Un is still Kim Jong Un, and he's still kind of a power-hungry, mad dictator that kills family members he thinks is a threat to him, and things like that. So the war still is not over. If you look at this last slide with the casualties, 5 million people died during the war. Most of those were Chinese and North Koreans. If you look at, dead, 34,000 Americans died, more than 600,000 Chinese died in action, and over 400,000 North Koreans and over 200,000 South Koreans. But the American forces had about 34,000 killed in action. And this war is pretty much forgotten between what went on in World War II and what went on in Vietnam, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So here are your questions for today. Why did North Korea decide to invade South Korea? What got Douglas MacArthur fired? Why was he fired? And the last question is, why do you think this war has been forgotten? It's not really over. It's not ended, but it is kind of a tie. Maybe that has something to do with it. So think about why you think this war has been forgotten between World War II and Vietnam. All right, have a good one.